This is Julie Pearson, Little Founder with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. Today's August 7th, 2023, and I'm in Stillwater, Oklahoma at the OSU Library interviewing Choctaw citizen David Skinner. David, you're an OSU alumnus who's worked with a variety of cuisines, but you've lately been devoting yourself to exploring and sharing indigenous foods and cooking styles. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your life and career. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
So I was born in Ponca City. Grew up probably a good portion of my life in Ponca City. We moved around a little bit while I was really young, so we just kind of kept migrating north. So we went to Wichita, and then from Wichita to Kansas City to Des Moines, then Des Moines to Peoria, and then we came back to Ponca City. So I graduated high school in Ponca City.
Wow. So a number of different schools.
Yeah, a number of different schools, yeah.
What did your folks do for a living?
My mother was a teacher, and my dad was in the commercial printing business. So,
What was your relationship with your grandparents on both sides of your family?
really good. My mother's side, I probably spent a little more time with them. So my grandmother was a pastry chef. My grandfather worked for Conoco. And then on the other side, my dad's side, they had a printing business. And so I kind of spent my youth doing multiple things. I'd spend time at the printing shop, and then I'd also spend time with my grandmother in the kitchen. And it was good growing up. I have no complaints.
Already doing both business and
Business and cooking, yeah, exactly, and oil and gas. So. Yeah,
oh wow.
yeah.
And so is the Choctaw ancestry on your?
It's on my dad's side.
Dad's side, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So my great grandmother was full blood Choctaw, and then so kind of just
right
comes down.
You had a special cooking relationship with your pastry chef grandmother.
Yes, I did.
How did that start?
I guess it started when I was probably like 4 years old. I asked her to make me a carousel cake. So I wanted a
Can
cake.
you explain what those are?
Well, yeah. So if you imagine like a merry-go-round carousel, I said I wanted a birthday cake that looked like that, and if she could make it twirl around, that'd be great too. And didn't twirl around, but she did make a cake that looked like a carousel, and I think that's probably what got me, interested in cooking, because it was like, wow, if you could make kind of anything out of food, it would be, kind of a fun thing to do. So I would hang out with her, and then she always had gardens. We'd spend the whole summer picking her garden and canning, and a lot of people are like, what was it like growing up? I'm like, great, because we had fresh food all the time. That was just kind of how I grew up, And then when I put the restaurant in Stillwater, when I moved here to go to college, I'd have the Cisco people come by, and it's like, can we sell you this? And I'm like, I don't want anything to do with that, That's not the kind of canned food I use. So, yeah.
So that is neat, because you obviously early on developed a taste for, you knew what fresh food tasted like.
I knew what it tasted like. Yeah, there's a big difference between fresh and processed. Yeah.
But you did start off baking. What's the early baking memory, maybe, of something that didn't turn out, or something that was especially fun to make?
Yeah, so she would, she had the touch. I mean, she could do little intricate things, and she was always trying to teach me how to make these frosting roses. And she could make them in like a second, She'd have her little thing, and she'd twirl it, and she'd be squeezing the icing onto it. Next thing you know, here's a rose, and she put it on the cake, because she loved doing like these big elaborate wedding cakes and things. And she'd always like, okay, here's what you do, and just do it this way, and I do it. I just have this big glob of icing, sitting on it. I was like, that's just not for me. I'm never going to be able to do that. But yeah, and then she would teach me how to bake, and she taught me kind of all of her little secrets of, here's how you keep a cake moist, and these are the things you do, and all that. And, I'd never seen anybody bake a cake with a wet towel on top of it, and that was kind of her secret. So kind of steam the cake as it baked in the oven.
Wow.
Yeah.
Neat little tips.
All these little tips, yeah.
So your grandma Mimi gave you a set of chef knives and the Julia Child's second volume of French cooking, or?
It was the full set.
It was the full set.
The full set.
Okay. And was this before or after you met Julia Child?
Before.
Okay.
Before, yeah.
So how did she know you would like those gifts?
So one of the things I would typically do, the PBS station in Oklahoma would play Julia Child Saturday morning, like 9 o'clock in the morning. And that was like my favorite thing to watch. So I'd be at her house and I'd watch that, and then she'd be like, well, do you want to try and make it? Or I'm like, yes, absolutely, why not? So let's do that, And it just kind of got me into it. It wasn't just Julia Child. I mean, there was, Paul Prudhomme. I mean, there were all kinds of, PBS was a great, kind of alternate universe to, cartoons in the morning, And it was something that we could kind of watch together and things. And she'd tell me, okay, well, this is kind of how you would do that and whatever. And, I was probably like 8 years old, something like that, 8 or 9 years old. And anyway, and then she put in a gourmet store in Ponca City. It was called the Wire Whisk, kind of like Williams-Sonoma. And the great thing about that was she had every possible kitchen gadget you could imagine. And so I would always go through the store and it's like, ooh, I'd like to have that. She's like, well, just take it and, play with it, see what you think. So I got all these kitchen gadgets. And then she would have chefs come through. And back then, I mean, this was like, early 80s, actually late 70s, early 80s. And, chefs were not what they are today. I mean, there wasn't the star status or all that, but she had, like Joyce Ching come through. And Joyce taught me how to make noodles, and cook Chinese food. And, and I've still got all these signed copies from all of these chefs that she would have come through and, teach me little things. And I don't know, it was a great time growing up.
Yeah, and so kind of shaping you for that vocation too.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And then I told her, I said, well, I think this is what I want to do. I want to be a chef because it was just a lot of fun. And part of it was I got to cook with her. And so that was always great. But she was like, well, someday you can open a restaurant. I'm like, yeah, that's what I want to do. And then one day she was like, you know what, I got space in the back of the store. If you want to open a restaurant, you could do that. And I was like, okay. Let's just do that,
Well, we'll talk about that more in a minute. I just had to, because I have to mention that I read that you cooked everything in that second volume of French cooking. You set yourself that goal. And I think this was like way before the Julia
it was.
movie, right?
Way before. I'm a lot older, yeah. Yeah. Actually, both volumes.
What gave you that idea?
Cooked both volumes.
Okay, you cooked your way through both volumes.
Well, her whole thing was, she's like, because I'd watched the show and I was like, oh, this is great. And, we'd make stuff. But she's like, you really need to have a good understanding. And the only way to do that is really repetition and cook a lot of recipes. And my family used to always get together on Sunday. Sunday was our family day, right? And so everybody would have lunch together and, we'd sit around and talk and watch TV and the football games and whatever, And that was just Sunday. And so she's like, you should start making these courses, for Sunday dinner and then I don't have to do Sunday roast or fried chicken or whatever. You can make whatever. And so that's what I did. I was just like, all right, we'll start out. And we did it and, did the aspics and everything, and some of the things turned out well, some didn't. Some went over well with the family, some didn't. The aspics were a little kind of, meat jello. It's not quite, wasn't quite what people were thinking. But, and then, we would just, sometimes I'd have to fly in food and we'd drive over to Tulsa and pick it up and stuff. So,
wow.
yeah, it became kind of a whole family affair. But,
right.
but it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Did you tell that to Julia Child when you met her?
Oh yeah. And she was just like, wow, again, long before the movie and the book and all that.
Yes.
She was just like, wow, okay.
I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So that's how the initial restaurant came about. She told you that she has a space back there. Maybe you should think about opening a restaurant. And you did. But you were already kind of an entrepreneur, I guess.
Yes, I was.
So I'm wondering what came first, your desire to cook or the desire to maybe make some extra money or?
Probably the business side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did you go about it? How did you go about setting up your restaurant?
The restaurant?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the restaurant was probably easier than my first store. Which was a magic shop.
Right.
Yeah, I did that when I was 13, and
in the back space of.
No, this was in a different space. So my parents put in a little shopping mall in Ponca City, in the downtown, and I just told my parents, I'm like, I want to have a magic shop, and they're like, okay, fine, why not? We're the landlords, so I guess we can do it. So I had this little tiny space, not much bigger than this room, and that they kind of carved out for me, kind of right by the stairwell, and so I came up with an idea, and it was called DC's Emporium, and we went to the Dallas market, and I go to the vendors, and they're all looking at me, and here's this little 13-year-old kid, and my mother would be with me, and they're like, this isn't really his, is it? She's like, yes, it's his shop, and so I got written up in the Dallas, newspaper and all this stuff. And the hardest and the funniest part was, back then, this was like 76, 77, somewhere in there. To get a tax permit, they would send somebody to your location to meet with you and interview you. And then they would sign off on your paperwork, I mean, this was a long time ago. And so anyway, so the guy comes and my mother's sitting there and he's like looking at her and he looks at me and he's like, this is his shop? And she's like, yes, it's his. He's used his own money. This is all his. And he's like, I'm not going to ask you your age. And I was like, okay, I don't care. He's like, no, I'm not going to ask you your age. We'll go through all this. And so he did. He never asked me my age, signed off on it. Here's your permit, And later I was realizing it was like, oh yeah, I had to be 18.
Right. You're breaking.
There you go. But that was a long time ago. But yeah, I would open it after school. I hired my friends, they would work, and so it was a good, but not many 13-year-olds have a brick and mortar, So.
No. That's a great story.
Yeah.
So you named your restaurant La Vie en Rose. How did you choose that name?
It was after Edith Piaf's song.
Oh, okay, yeah. Did you get into, what was your exposure to French language or culture before that?
Well, not great in Ponca City.
But you had heard of Edith Piaf.
Yeah. So, as I was kind of going through old Julia Child's recipes, I was like, well, we should have French music playing in the background stuff. And so I started researching that. And next thing you knew, I was a fan of Edith Piaf. And, we'd have we'd have Sunday dinner, and we'd have Edith Piaf playing in the background, and here's beef bourguignon, and
Wow.
yeah. So my family thought it was great fun, and I did too.
For sure. So what was the most challenging thing about running your own restaurant?
Really, probably the time commitment. Just
Because you're in school.
because I'm in school, and so we started out, and it would just be in the evenings, and then lunch on Saturday. So almost like my restaurant now, we would open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and that was kind of it. So I get out of school. Of course, I was in the DECA program, so I get out early.
Explain that one a little bit.
Yeah, well, it was basically kind of like a club, and it was for students that would go and get jobs and work in places, and so you could get out early from school. You got credit for basically working. Yeah. So I do that, and so I get out of school like 2:00, get to the restaurant, prep, and then we would start, service at like 5 and go till about 10:00 at night, and just a few tables, and but it did well, and then eventually we had so many people wanting to come eat that we put in a kind of more like a to-go and deli business with the restaurant, and then that will be open every day for lunch. And so then I hired.
Kind of
She did. She helped, and then I hired employees, and they would run it during the day until I got in there, and turned into this kind of full-time job.
Right.
So it used to be just weekends, and then it turned into kind of every day. But
right.
That's all right.
Did you, for your servers, who did you hire?
Some of my friends from high school, and then just some local people too that wanted to serve. And then my grandmother and my grandfather would help out too.
Right.
So
that is so cool.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of family support.
Yeah, I got a lot of family support. Yeah.
So how did you end up deciding to pursue college?
I didn't want to.
Why did you close your restaurant, I guess, and then decide to come to college?
Yeah, I didn't want to. Well, actually, we didn't close it. My grandmother kept it open until she closed the store.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I didn't want to go to college at all. My mother made me, but she's a very smart person. She was right. She just said, you can cook. I know you can cook. You can always get a job cooking, right? But you need a hard degree. You need a real degree of some sort. She goes, you can do whatever you want. You can't go to cooking school, but you can do whatever you want to do. And I was like, okay, fine. After much sort of gnashing of teeth, and it's like, I really don't want to go do that, So anyway, I'm like, well, my dad went to OSU. My grandfather was a huge, posse club member, and I remember, wow, this really dates me, but I was telling my daughter, because we were driving down Washington. Every time I come here, I drive by the old restaurant just to see what it looks like, and I'm like, you know why they call it the Strip, don't you? And she's like, no. I'm like, because people used to street down this, in the 70s. And she's like, what? And I'm like, yeah, they'd take off all the students, they'd take off all their clothes, and they'd run down the street. And she's like, no way. And I'm like, that's exactly right. So that's why it's called the Strip. And she's like, how do you know that? I'm like, because I was around when they were still doing it. And my grandfather would take me to the football games. We'd go like, almost every game. I don't think he ever missed one. And he had a RV, a big Winnebago, and it was painted OSU orange, and it had Cowboys on it. I mean, and so we come down here, and we go down the Strip, we go eat at Coney Island and stuff, and and then he would tell me about story, I was just like, really, So yeah, that was.
And for somebody coming from your food background to come to Stillwater at that time and have
It was a
either
food desert.
school food or yes, I was going to ask you if you had memorable.
It was a food desert. Well, I mean, I remember, we go. My daughter loves Joe's, so every time we come, we take her to Joe's, and I'm like, this isn't the Joe's I grew up with,
Mm-hmm.
This is a tame version of what it used to be, when they used to have the block parties and, all that. I'm like, not that anymore, This is a very mild version of what it used to be. But, yeah, so it was a lot of fun. But she was right. She was just like, you figure out what you want to do, go do it. And if you don't like that, well, open a restaurant. You can do whatever you want. So when I came to OSU, I actually opened another restaurant, which was called Christopher's on Washington. So now it's the Curdy Shack. But I was the first one to put a restaurant at. Before that, it was a house and a was it like an insurance agent or something? It was like just an office when I rented it, and so I put in the kitchen. We opened up the floor because it had a basement. So we opened up the floor, put stairs in, and put a bar downstairs. And the bar was called the Glass Onion. And so I mean, it was it was quite an adventure.
For Stillwater.
It was a first for Stillwater. There was no fine dining. I mean, at that time, it was.
And this is what year?
This has been like 80, probably about 85, 84, 85, somewhere in there. Yeah.
But you had already gotten your degree. You had a major in finance. Okay.
No, I was getting my degree.
You were getting your degree in finance and economics.
That's what I finally ended up with.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're getting your degree and you decide to open the restaurant while you're doing that.
Right.
Wow. That's a lot.
It was. And I was in a fraternity. And which was actually, it was a lot of fun. I was glad I did it. But I would get, brothers from the house, and they would be servers and
sure,
dishwashers and everything else. And my grandfather used to drive from Ponca almost every day, and he would help me in the kitchen. And so it was great. I mean, I would never give up those years because it was nice spending time with him and all that. Because when I graduated, I timed the lease so that it would come up basically when I was going to graduate, and then I could kind of decide, do I want to keep this or do I want to do something different? And I was kind of burned out at that point because working a full-time restaurant that was open, 5 days a week, and going to school and Delt House, just everything. I was just like, okay, and I thought, well, I spent all this money on college, I got these degrees, I should just see if there's anything out there that I like to do. And so that's what I did. I closed the restaurant, and that turned in. Actually, two of my pledge brothers took over the space and put in Two Frogs, which was like beer and burgers and hot dogs, so fine dining to burgers. But I was glad they took over the space, and and that was kind of my time at OSU. But it was fun too because there was a professor I had for economics, and his name escapes me at this point. But he was only here for maybe a couple of years, and he came in from, I think it was Berkeley. He was definitely a California guy. He was almost like a surfer dude. And anyway, I had him in class, and he started talking one day about Chinese food, and and so I'm like, well, I know Joyce Chin, and he's like, what, you know? And so anyway, so he actually came and he would help me sometimes at the weekend when we were really busy. He'd be back in the kitchen and helping, you know. It was just, yeah. So I had a great time at OSU, which is partly why my daughter goes here, because like, you know, she's heard stories and all that. So anyway,
that's so neat. So so what was the next phase of your work life?
So when I graduated, I went to work for a commodity trading company. And I actually used my education and built some probabilistic trading systems for soybeans and other things, and did that for a couple of years. And then my grandfather had a heart attack and died. And my grandmother was like, hey, would you come back to Ponca and you just help me, you know, with some stuff. And I was like, and at that point I was like kind of so worn out. I was like, yeah, sure, why not? So I came back, helped her kind of with his estate and stuff, and then like half my family worked for Conoco, and they're all like, you need to just come work for Conoco, you know, just like the family business, right? You know, you should just come work, you know. And I was like, I don't know if I want to do that. And then one of my family members was like, there's a new guy in from DuPont, because at the time DuPont still owned Conoco, and he's trying to start this new group doing this decision analysis stuff. I don't know. Nobody really understands what he's trying to do, but he's looking for people, you know, do you want me to set up like a lunch or something with you? And I was like, okay, why not, you know. So I went and met with him. His name was Tom Science. Smartest person I probably ever met in my entire life. And he's like, here's the issue we got. We have all this money coming in for the R&D. It comes from the business units. They look at it like a tax, and we haven't really turned out any new technology in a decade. And he's like, if we don't change that, they're just going to cut off the funding. And he's like, when I was at DuPont, we used this process called decision analysis. We did it on a dipic acid plant. It was the, you know, first time we'd ever done that, and it was this huge success, saved the company, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, all this stuff. And I was like, oh, okay, that sounds pretty interesting, you know. And he's like, are you up for it? And he goes, now, you're gonna have to work with all these researchers, you're gonna have to teach them, you know, all this. And I'm like, sounds like fun. How hard could that be, right? What did I know? So he's like, okay, well, you're hired, come to work Monday, you know, kind of thing. So I go to work for Conoco and did that for almost 10 years. And we had the plane crash, that was in 92, if I remember right. And that took out most of the executives. And so some of my big supporters died in that crash. And then things just changed, and the whole culture of the company just kind of changed. And my group kept doing well, and we kept growing and growing. I had, like 8 or 9 employees at that point that reported to me and we're doing projects all over the world, which is, I mean, you know, my typical day would be hop on a plane in Ponca, and I'd go to Houston, or I'd go to Wilmington, or I'd go somewhere overseas. And then, you know, Friday night, I'm coming back home, you know, spend the weekend in Ponca, and then I'm off somewhere else. So lots of traveling. And but we did some really, really great work. And that was when I wrote the first book, because there weren't all the books that were out on decision analysis were very much just pure textbook. There was like no common sense in it. It was just formulas and all this. And I'm like, this does not work for most people that just want to know, how do I make a better decision, right? And that's what we were trying to teach them. And that's what we're focused on with with the research staff was, don't work on things that aren't going to add value to the company, because they would just give money and the researchers were open to do whatever they wanted. So they dream up all these ideas and it was funny. There's a guy I'm still friends with today. His name was John Queen. He was in the very first class that I taught. And he was a geological physicist. And I started in on my slideshow and he raised his hand and he's like, Mr. Skinner, before we get started, I just want to bring up one little issue. And I'm like thinking, okay, not going to be a big deal. What about Heisenberg? And I'm like, excuse me? And he's like, look, you're here, you're influencing all of us. You've already changed, our trajectory for our research. So we need to talk about that. And I was like, oh my gosh. So for the next 4 hours, we talked about Heisenberg and how all this was going to kind of play out. And at the end, he was like, okay, I'm satisfied. Let's move on. And
you're still friends.
We're still friends,
Cool.
We wrote a bunch of papers together. We did, he brought me into MIT to teach there. I mean, it was, so it was quite but that was my very first day of training at Conoco was, let's talk about Heisenberg. So, yeah, it's been an interesting life.
Oh my gosh. So, how about when you finally got ready to open your third restaurant? This would be
Eculent.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So,
had you started your family yet?
I had, yeah. So my daughter was born in 2003. Started Eculent in 2014. So Conoco was great groundwork because the stuff that I did there was applicable in a lot of different industries, and I actually asked Conoco for a sabbatical. I got 6 months. They let me go, and I ended up setting up a business called Decision Strategies. And my first client was Amoco, and then from there picked up Mobile and then Exxon, and pretty soon had all the majors, all the super majors, and then we started growing. We did airlines, we did utilities, we did lots of work in pharmaceuticals. I just built up this large consulting firm that I ran until 2010. And in 2010, I sold it to the employees because I had a new venture that I was working on. At the time, that was kind of when unconventional assets were really coming to the forefront. So tight gas, shale, all these things where you knew the hydrocarbon was there. It's just how do you get it out in an economical fashion? And the thing that I saw was they were using huge amounts of water to frack these wells. And no one had a good method for reclaiming that water. So they had really high disposal costs, and it was a lot of water, like 400,000 barrels for a well. And I saw that because we were working a lot of those projects for our clients. And every time I was just looking at them like $4, $6, $12 a barrel to dispose of. It's like, this is crazy numbers, There should be something that's just water. We should be able to clean it up and do something with it. And so I started looking around and had a good friend, and he was kind of this technology curmudgeon, and so he kind of knew people doing different things. And I was talking to him about it. He's like, "Oh, you need to call my friend. He's up at the School of Mines, and he's got exactly what you're looking for." And I'm like, "No, that's not possible." So sure enough, called this guy up. He's like, "Oh yeah, we're doing it," And I was like, "Why aren't you like a billionaire at this point?" Because, and he's like, "I don't really know either. Nobody seems to." So anyway, I go meet with him, and takes me to his plant, and it's out in the middle of this organic cornfield. He's got 30 stripper wells hooked up to it, and he's pumping the water right under the ground. I go, "How did you get this permitted?" Because here's our test results. It's drinkable. It's that clean. And I was like, okay, we're going to do a deal. And I'm like, here, write on a piece of paper, I'm going to take your stuff and market it everywhere. And he was like, okay, great, because he had been trying for like 5 years and got nowhere. But he was talking to like the foreman, and I'm like, no, you have to go to the decision maker. I know the decision makers. So a week later, I got my friend who we had worked together at Conoco, and he was operations VP for El Paso. And I'm like, John, how much are you spending? He's like, oh my God, it's a huge headache. I'm like, well, if I could do it for like $1. He's like, where do I sign? And I'm like, you got to see this. And so we hop on a private jet. We fly to Colorado with his whole tech team. They climb all over this equipment. They go over all of his science, all the stuff. And on the way back, he's like, I'll take 4 plants. And I'm like, okay, I'm in business. Because I had a deal for 25 cents a barrel forever. And I was like, oh, I'm done. I'm retired now. And I get home, I call the scientist back up, and I'm like, hey, I sold 4 plants. He's like, well, that's great. I'm like, can we have these in like 6 months? He's like, oh, no, it'll be years, And I'm like, years? What are you talking? Well, every well is going to be different. We're going to have to do all this study. And so immediately I was like, this is why he's never sold anything. Because in his mind, it's just this big research experiment, which was all the people I used to deal with at Conoco. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So guess what? I'm going to have to start a new business. So I set up a business, brought in some friends, put together this management team, went out and raised $10 million in angel round. And then we ended up raising $50 million from Michael Dell and his fund out in New York. And we're off to the races. Except that was probably not the right investor to take in. And we started having issues. And anyway, and so 4 years in that venture, and I was like, I got to go. I can't stay here anymore. Business is still going today, but it's like, I got to go.
Right.
So I told him I was leaving, and my wife's like, okay, what are you going to do now? She goes, you going to start a new consulting firm? And I'm like, I have this idea for a really crazy restaurant. And she's just like, you are crazy. And I'm like, look, I'm about to turn 50. If I don't do it before I turn 50, I will never do it. I'll just say, nah, too old. It's a young man's game. I'm not gonna mess with it. And she's like, okay. And I know in the back of her mind, she was thinking 6 months. I give him 6 months, and then he'll be like, this is too hard. I'm done.
So explain your idea for your crazy idea for your.
Yeah. So I wanted to do, as you can probably tell, I like doing kind of first. So I wanted to do a restaurant that no one had done before, and it came about because I was on a business trip to Beijing, and which is a really terrible long flight, no matter how you go. And I had a meal at the airport, and it did not agree with me. So 20 hours on this plane, I'm having stomach issues, and I never sleep on planes. I can't sleep on a plane, so I'm always up, and I can't watch 17 movies. So I always take a notebook, and I just do thought experiments and stuff. And what came out was, why can't they have a decent restaurant at the airport and one that doesn't cost an arm and a leg? Because you always pay 10 times the price for a bad taco or whatever.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking about it, and then that kind of morphed into what restaurant's never been done. And that was the real hard thought experiment. It's like, what? Who's created something that no one's ever done before, right? In a restaurant. And you think about all the different fusions and all the different formats and everything. And so literally on the way over, I couldn't think of anything. It's like everything's been done. And then had a good week in Beijing, and on the way back, I was thinking, okay, I need to apply my own technique to this problem. let's just break it down. What are all the elements of a restaurant? And the first thing I thought of was, okay, the atmosphere in every restaurant is static, and it conforms to the restaurant itself. So if you think about a Mexican restaurant, if you go in, I guarantee you somewhere in the background will be mariachi music. There'll be at least one sombrero on a wall somewhere, and the colors are going to be those of the Mexican flag. Every time you go to a Mexican restaurant, that's what it is, right? Or there'll be, serape on the wall, but it will, and so I started thinking about that, and then I started just like doing research, and I was like, it's because the way our mind thinks, we have all these cues. And so if you walked into a Mexican restaurant and the inside looked like a Japanese restaurant, you might not even completely step into the restaurant because you might open the door and go, oh, this isn't what I thought, and you turn around and leave, right? And so I started thinking about, wow, there are so many kind of mind games you could play, and so what if I made a restaurant that the atmosphere was dynamic, so we could just change it on a whim, right? I push a button, it's a different color. Push a button, it's a different smell. Push a button, it's different music, right? And so I started really kind of researching that. Found a guy in the UK called Charles Spence that had done a lot of research on colors and smells and sounds and how that affects food. And all of a sudden I was like, wow, that's a big thing. If you put a red light on, it's going to make you more hungry. Put a blue light on, it calms you down. Green is it's just like all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And I started thinking about, okay, well, how would I do that, right? Because this is, 2014, yeah, there's a lot of technology and things out, but no one had really built anything where it's like you can change lights, and the smell was probably the most difficult. The lights, there were some Philips systems that had come out, and so we started with those. We've migrated, we've changed the lighting systems a couple times now, but smell was the hardest one.
And you're thinking this is the dynamic part is in terms of the owner who's doing that. It's not an interactive thing.
It's not interacting with the guest. No,
gotcha.
It's so I control it.
Yeah.
And then I started reading about all the different things you could do with smell and how you could impact people's smell, and so I found a fragrance designer in California. He did Katy Perry's tour where she wanted the whole auditorium to smell like bubble gum, and so this guy did it, And I'm like, okay, so I call him up, I tell him what I'm doing. He's like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. He goes, I want to work with you, because nobody's ever done anything like this. I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm after. Nobody's done this before. And so we spent, probably 6 or 7 months just trying to figure out what smells might work, wouldn't work. And so he'd send me all these vials of smells, and then it was like, okay, well, how do we get these out? What do you do with them, right? You could smell them, but how do you get into the air? How do you impact the diner in a way that it's not, too obtrusive, and at the same time, because you want to enhance the food. You don't want to overpower it.
Right.
So smell was the hardest, because smell is the quickest way to recall memories. You smell something and it's familiar, and it's like immediately takes you back to childhood or whatever. And so we built these systems from scratch with these scent generators in the ceiling where I could do multiple smells and just push a button and it's like, okay, it now smells like a forest. Push a button and it smells like barbecue. Push a button and which just completely confounded people. We learned that we could fill in tasting notes in a dish with smell for people who had allergies. So, there's just...
They didn't have to actually
they didn't have to
eat
eat it,
that they were
but
allergic
you could
to,
completely completely fill in that profile on the food by just smell. But the hard part was trying to figure out, okay, should the smell be complementary? Should it be counter? Should it be the same smell? Do you introduce it before the dish comes out, during the dish, after the dish? And so we've spent probably a good first 2 years just trying to kind of figure all that out. And do you always want to put it in the air? So then we developed these forks where we could put the scent on the fork itself. So as they would take a bite, that's when they would get the smell, and everybody be different. And anyway, developed all these crazy techniques. But
that's so interesting. And was it your patrons themselves who supplied some of the information about that, or were you?
Oh, we were always
just visiting.
So when we
with people afterwards.
I'll always talk to them.
Yeah.
I'm out talking to the guests all night.
Gotcha.
But we did 6 months of free dinners.
Okay.
And just asked people to come in and just be guinea pigs. And so we'd be playing with the lights and the smells and music. I had a music director that would come in and, because certain tones and tempos make you more hungry, less hungry, can actually impact the taste of the food. And so it was just like a big lab.
What an amazing, area of research to open up. Yeah.
And then we, in order to do the food we do, we built an entire food lab. So, very much like the lab I had at Conoco, and it's just, So we have centrifuges and freeze dryers and rotovapes and everything, and we used to do tours of the lab until COVID, and that came about completely happenstance because we do these free dinners. And we serve everybody at the same time, so there's no staggering of people because you don't want one person to see kind of the next course before the next person. And so one night I was like waiting on half the people to show up, and it's like, well, where are these people going to come? They're calling them all this, and I was like, okay, well, I don't want you to just sit here for the next 20 minutes. Would you like to see the food lab? And they're like, oh yeah, let's see the food lab. So take them outside through a little secret entrance. We go in the food lab, and their eyes got this big, and they're like, what is this place? And I'm like, this is my lab. This is my little play area. And they're like, oh my gosh, you have to take everybody through this every night, And so that's how our tours of the food lab kind of got started. And so we would take everybody through the food lab before dinner, and then and I think it gave more of an appreciation for some of the techniques and some of the things that we did.
The things that went into the...
But then the pandemic happened, and it's like, I can't bring all these people in here. And so we just stopped. But.
Yeah, so how did the pandemic impact your choice to, because after that, I guess you opened the preserve.
We opened the preserve this May. So it's not,
you haven't opened it yet?
No, it's open.
Got you, it's open. You opened it this past May.
This past May, yeah. So it's not been open too long.
But you're still running eculents.
We still have both. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is the focus on bites, on small portions, as I understood it?
Yeah, so eculent's a 30-course tasting menu. So dinner is about 3 hours. You'll have things you've never seen, never heard of, never tasted before. You have different combinations of things you would never.
It's really an experience.
It's an experience.
For.
That's what you're paying. Yeah, it's an experience. Yeah. And so anyway, I was during the pandemic. I was just kind of like, what do we do now? We shut down for 6 weeks, like everybody did. But luckily, so we had a really great article in the Washington Post. So their food critic came to, this little tiny town in Kemah and had my food and said it was better than Michelin restaurants. And so then, the floodgates opened, and, we'd sell 3 months of reservations in 30 seconds. And, it was just, it was crazy.
So you were able, after the initial phases of COVID, you were able to...
We never, other than the 6 weeks we shut down, we were full.
People and
we haven't had an empty seat in 6 years. So it just stays full. But during COVID, I met Graham and Benjamin Painter, who opened this Thai restaurant called Street to Kitchen. And the two of us were in this truffle masters competition together. And it was really weird because it was during the pandemic, and so normally it's this big event, all the chefs come in and everything, and because of the pandemic, they were like, well, we're not going to have a big event. So you had to go to each person's restaurant to try their dish, and then you could vote online, which was really kind of weird. But anyway, so I looked at their submission and I was like, what in the world is this? It was black truffle, durian, and crab. And I'm like, that's the weirdest combination I have ever heard of. I have to try this, because it's so crazy. I mean, because I traveled so much, especially to Asia, I mean, I knew durian, and it's the smelliest food ever.
Well,
I mean,
what is it?
it's a fruit, and it's usually about this big. It's spiked, and it's the nastiest smelling thing. I mean, it's the most putrid smell you can imagine. It's like pure sulfur and stinky feet, and anyway, it's bad. But they love it, and you'll find all over Asia, Southeast Asia especially. And so I'm like, durian and truffle, those are like really stinky, smells really great. And it's like, I gotta try that. So I go to the restaurant and I'm like, hi, and they're like, oh my God, Chef David, you're here. And I'm like, I want to try this, this is too crazy. I have to see what it's like. I try, I'm like, that's fantastic. How in the world did you ever think to, And so then we just got talking and we struck up this friendship, and I go eat at the restaurant about once a week every time I go in the city, and then
this is in Houston proper.
In Houston proper, and then they would come down, and have dinner at Eculent, and then one day I was just like, we ought to do a restaurant together. They were like, oh, that'd be great. Let's do it. What should we do? And I'm like, well, I've been thinking about this thing, and I'm like, there's not a restaurant other than, Heston Blumenthal has done some restaurants in London, or UK basically, that he explores kind of historical British dishes, But I said, no one's really done an indigenous type restaurant. There's just not much out there. There are indigenous restaurants in different places, but nobody, they all kind of seem to serve like the same thing, and you'll have fry bread and you'll have this and that. And I'm like, fry bread was a government, thing. And yeah, it's delicious, but that's not real, and it's not indigenous. It came out of desperation, so we'll never serve fry bread. But it's just like, it seems like there ought to be something there, to tell a story. And Binchuan is Thai, and so we started talking, and she grew up. Her family had restaurants, so she grew up with her grandmother. We were kind of similar, And anyway, I was just like, what if we did an indigenous restaurant based on Native American and Thai food? And so anyway, so we started doing all this research, and come to find out, guess what? The techniques, the cooking techniques, the preservation techniques were almost identical, and the ingredients are almost identical once you go past a certain period of time. So everybody thinks of Thai food as spicy and hot and all this. That's a recent invention. That's modern Thai. And like chicken pad Thai is like fry bread. It's a government invention made for Westerners. It's not, you go to somebody, chicken pad, they're like, what? Nobody makes that, like chicken tikka masala for the British, that's not Indian food. That's the British version of an Indian dish, it's like, anyway. So the more we started talking about it, the more I'm like, okay, we're onto something here. So we spent a good year just doing research on all the different ingredients and cooking techniques and things like that. And chilies came along, with the Portuguese and the spice trade, and they actually went to India first, and then they came from India to Thailand. But that's in the last 500 years, which sounds like a long time, but not really, And we came across this kind of fact that 60% of the world's cuisines, their ingredients came from the Americas. So if you think about what would Italian food be without tomatoes, right? Because tomatoes, potatoes, onions, chilies, peppers, corn, all this came from the Americas, and a lot of it from North America. Potatoes more kind of South America, but it all had been migrating through the Americas long before Columbus and everybody else showed up, and so there's kind of this, this food, pantry, that then spread throughout the world, and then on the flip side, black pepper came from Thailand. So that came the reverse way of the spice trade. And chicken. So everybody, I think chicken's but chicken was actually red guinea fowl in Thailand that apparently, from what they could tell from the genetics, looks like it got mated with the gray guinea fowl. And then that turned into what we have as kind of chicken today. But that came from Thailand and back, So it was a really interesting uncovering of this is how some things went, and then they turn into something, and then they come back, or then there'd be new ingredients that would come, and then like in the U.S., we didn't have any pork. There were no pigs until DeSoto brought them in 1540. So you start to think about all those things, and like one of the currently most famous Choctaw dishes, Tanchi Labona, is corn soup with pork. Well, that came about around 1545 after DeSoto had brought them pigs. And there's actually a Choctaw breed of pig that we've been trying to get our hands on because the nation has them, but we can't get FDA or USDA approval to slaughter them and bring them to Texas. So anyway, it's there's a whole, but that's that's our history, right?
Right.
And so that was the idea, was the more it was like peeling an onion. You just here's another layer. And you're like, oh my God, that's so incredible. And then you just keep going and going and going. And so anyway, it's like I was at the cultural center a couple months ago, and there's these great dioramas. It's such a great cultural center. I encourage anybody to go see it down in Durant. Yeah. But the original corn, the Choctaw corn, which they're bringing that heritage corn back, but the stalks were 20 feet tall. So you think of a cornfield now, and you got maybe 8 foot corn stalks, 20. That's 2 stories, right?
Yeah.
And the corn cobs used to be like 2 feet long. They were huge, and so you look at what we have today versus that, and you're just like, what all's gone on with genetic breeding and everything else.
Monoculture.
Monsanto,
Yeah.
And so anyway, that was, that dish came about because they grew corn and squash and beans, and you have the 3 sisters, but then here comes pork, and so now you've got this new wonderful dish. So pork came from Spain, and it's just interesting, as you start to unravel.
Right.
Because today, unfortunately, most kids don't have any idea where anything comes from. It's like, where does the tomato come from? The grocery store. No, where does the tomato come from? The grocery store.
True.
And
so
it's like, no, it came from a farm. Well, who raised? Did you even know that it's not a vegetable? It's a fruit. It's just like,
yes.
All these things. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do with the new restaurant, is educate people on where the food really came from, who was responsible for it.
Yes.
Here's what it really is and what it really should taste like, versus processed stuff that you get. So.
And I'm thinking too, it's that opportunity for those conversations about what's going on with climate change, right? And how it's impacting our indigenous foods here and across the world. And I was wondering if you've even felt, well, you've only been open since May, but some of the plans that you have to access or gather or whatever may.
Yeah, so we've been doing, part of the reason I decided to kind of do this restaurant was I wanted to take some of the research I'd already been doing for eculent further. So we've been doing Native American dishes at eculent for the last almost 4 years. And it just kind of started slowly introducing things, and people were just like, wow, that's really good. What is that? It's like, that's a Three Sisters dish, but it's not, because most Three Sisters, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but typically, it's like, I got beans, corn, and squash put together in succotash, right? And it's like, okay, that's fine, but what if you treated each component as its own star, right? What if you did something to it that made it so special people were just like, I can't believe that's what that is, right? So at Eculent, we do Three Sisters completely different than we do for the preserve. So it comes out on this glass plate with flowers coming out of the middle, and I have a squash cookie. So we use spaghetti squash, we cook it, and then we freeze dry it and turn it into basically it looks like a thumbprint cookie. Which again, kind of reminiscent of my grandmother, she always just make those. That was I could do, I could get my thumb in it. But, and then we fill the center with butternut squash puree. So it's just squash, it's just 2 squashes. But people pick it up and they eat it and they're just like, how can that be squash? And I'm like, because it's real squash. It's been treated the right way. It's not processed. It's not, And we use, high-end lab techniques to get a texture that you couldn't get any other way. You're not going to turn it into a cookie just putting it in the oven. It won't dehydrate right. I mean, you have to freeze dry it. It's the only way to get that texture. Right. But it's this light, airy, like thumbprint cookie made out of squash. And then for the corn dish, we serve it in a little crustade, a little cup that we make with shrimp on top, which a lot of people don't realize, but Choctaws went all the way down to Louisiana. So shrimp and fish and oysters and all that was part of the original Choctaw diet, And so for the corn butter, I mean, it takes me about 2 to 3 days to make this stuff because it's really labor intensive. But what you end up with is this like corn bomb in your mouth because it's so much corn. And it's probably the one dish that people are just like, that's the best thing I've ever had in my mouth, And so the corn's hot, the shrimp's cold. You get 2 different temperatures in your mouth at the same time, 2 different textures. It's like the perfect little bite. And then for the beans, I buy tepary beans from a reservation in Arizona, and then we do that with bone marrow. And so we turn that into a little puree and then put that inside a puff pastry shell. So again, kind of back to my French heritage, So there's always French techniques all through it. People are just like, isn't this like French? I'm like, it is, but in a different way. And so that's what we do in Eculent for Three Sisters. And then for the preserve, I came up with a dish called Night and Day. And so we serve it in a bowl that's actually 2 colors. And so the top is dark and the bottom's light, but the top we spread black tepary beans that I've done with vegetable ash. So it makes them really this black bean. Mm-hmm. The bottom is the corn butter with butternut squash puree dots in it. And then through the middle, we do a smoked fish. And people were just like, it's like the best thing I've ever had. I'm like, it is completely Native American. You know,
Right.
Native American with, French technique and, maybe a little bit of lab tools thrown in for good measure, but not the preserved one, but the eculent one.
Right.
And there's like, I can't get over it, because the thing that always growing up, if somebody said Native American food, you would only hear fry bread and Indian tacos.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, but that's not right. That's not
Right.
that's not what it is.
No.
Um,
What a great compliment that people are paying you. And it's so cool that we're seeing, indigenous dishes getting a lot of attention and native chefs getting a lot of attention, and finally just kind of having a moment there.
Yeah. Sean Sherman with Alumni up in Minneapolis, he's really come and paving the way for him. So we have kind of like different missions. His was really health for the tribe. So how do we get all this processed stuff out of our systems?
Yeah.
How do we go back to real food and all? And so that's kind of been his mission. Not so much the history, telling the story, here's where food came from and all that.
Right.
That's kind of more our story. That's kind of what we're trying to tell. And then you've got different other Native American chefs, doing things. We're next month we're in San Diego at it's called the Anti-Convention, which is a convention of mostly chefs and food writers and people like that. But myself and Ben Schwan, and then Sean Sherman's partner, and then we've got 2 other Native American chefs, I think maybe 3. They're going to be on stage doing a panel session, talking about it, and then we're going to do a cooking demonstration and some stuff. But it's starting to get there, but it's a completely kind of unknown. I mean, people know, and part of the reason. I mean, the other kind of funny thing is, so with Thai food, everybody kind of knows Thai food in the U.S., but what they know is the government version of Thai food. The government was really smart in this. They, Thailand's main economy is really tourism. And they're like, how do we get more people to come? Well, let's do it through food. So the government, you'll see all these Thai restaurants. When you go in, the menu is always the same. Matter of fact, the numbering system they're always the same, because the government gives them money to open the restaurant, but they can only have the money if they adhere to the government standards. And the government's like, this is the recipe for each one of these. So you go to any Thai restaurant, other than maybe spice levels, it's all going to be the same. And when G opened her restaurant, that's what we call Pinchwan, not that at all. It's like, this is real Thai food. This is what my grandmother made. This is what my mother made. And so she won the Best Chef Texas James Beard Foundation this year, partly because of that. But Thai food's proliferated, Mexican food. I mean, you think about all of these cultures and food that are not native to America, that are flourished everywhere, and yet our food, our real history, nobody knows.
Right, and when you dig, then you find those
find
colonization structures that underlie.
They do.
Even that Thai story is very interesting, because of course you dig deep enough there's colonization.
There's colonization. Yeah, theirs was probably not quite as much colonization as conquering. So the Khmer's conquered them, and I mean, there's a whole, but you have the influence of the Portuguese and the British. I mean, it's still,
Well, that is just so cool, and I think we'll kind of maybe wrap up with asking what advice you might have. You have this brilliant career going, and all this, innovative, pioneering stuff coming out, and thank you for all your contributions. What advice would you have for up-and-coming native chefs trying to start their own restaurants?
Don't ever be afraid to take a risk, especially if you're young. My daughter, she's going to school here, and she wanted to be an oral surgeon, and then first semester was great. Second semester, she was in animal bio, and she's like, Dad, I just hate this. I don't. And I'm like, you got 4 more years of that, and then we got. And she's just like, I don't know, I could do it. I'm like, stop, just stop, because if you're this miserable now, and she's like, but I feel like I'm going to be a failure. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you haven't even started, And the key is fail as many times as you can when you're young, because you don't want to fail when you're old. You can't afford it then. But when you're young, fail as many times as you can. And she's just like, okay. So she's in international business and marketing now, and we'll see how that goes. And who knows? Next semester it might be English, or I don't know, whatever. But it's okay, because I'm like, and I said that's the reason you're in college, is to figure out what it is you really want to do. Because most people don't know,
Right.
And when I called the first year success office to say, okay, what do we have to do to change, She's like, oh, it's pretty easy, they're just doing it. And the girl's like, tell her not to worry about it. I've changed my major 5 times, and I'm just a junior. I was like, okay, But yeah, I would say take a risk. If you're young, take a risk. There's always time to recover. When you get to my age now, it's like, okay, maybe not as many risks, but take a risk. Do something different. Do something you're passionate about. I think that's the real key. There's so many people that, friends I have that are in jobs, and they're just like, I hate this, And I'm like, why are you doing it? It's like, because I'm close to retirement, or I'm this, or I'm that, and I'm like, you're stuck, And that's part of the reason I probably never really worked for big companies, most of my life. I always had my own. So I can do what I want. Yeah, are there risks? Absolutely. And there are times you can't make payroll, and you're paying your employees, and you make nothing, and but it's okay. In the end, it kind of all works out. There wasn't anything in my life that I would change or give up or do over. It's just like, yeah, no, it's been a good life. I'm looking for the next exciting kind of adventure. Who knows what that will be. So
Right. Well, we'll be watching too, and thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely, pleasure to be here.